Hey everyone, we'll be getting started in just a couple minutes here. We'll give people a little more time to fill in. I know people have a lot of questions about this topic, so we've prepared a little bit on the actual content here, but please drop your questions in either the chat or the Q&A function of the Zoom meeting, and we'll answer them to the best of our ability at the end. Hey Tori, how's it going?
Going well. For once, we don't match.
Yeah. For those who don't know, Tori and I have a funny habit of accidentally wearing matching shirts almost every time we give a webinar together. So this is a landmark moment for us. We're coming up on our start time here, but we usually give it another minute or two. You know how it is with virtual meetings. Your phone buzzes right at the time it starts, and then you need, 30 to 90 seconds to scramble to your device and fire up the meeting, hope that Zoom doesn't need to update itself, and so on. So we usually start a minute or two behind the start time just to give everyone a little bit of an extra minute to filter in. All right, let's jump on into it, Tori. So, welcome everyone to our mini webinar on the digital ACT. This is unfortunately a mini webinar due to the paucity of information that ACT has provided us with so far. So, ACT made a very brief announcement on their leadership blog last week that they would be offering the digital test nationally, and that they would be, adding other what they call enhancements to the test to coincide with that digital launch. And they didn't go into too much detail on too much in that announcement. But actually, recently, as members of the NTPA, we attended a webinar actually just yesterday where ACT did give us a little bit more information than was in the initial announcement. So we're very excited to share with you a little bit more information than was in the initial announcement, as well as some context that we can provide, from having experienced the digital SAT transition, from being quite experienced with the ACT in general. So we will do our best to lay things out as far as ACT has made them clear to us. But please use the Q&A function through Zoom and drop your questions in the chat so that we can address those all at the end of the presentation. With that, I'll hand it over to Tori to get us started.
Yes. So the three major changes that we have gotten in this announcement are that first, the ACT will have a digital option. And we do say option because the paper test will still be available to all students, at least for now. They say, and hopefully we can trust them, that that paper option will be available indefinitely. These things are always hard to sort of suss out, but that's the information we have for now.
And that's a big
Additionally,
change relative to the SAT. The SAT completely got rid of its paper test when they launched the digital test.
yeah. And this does actually kind of go in, it's like in lockstep with how we've come to expect big changes from the ACT, is that the ACT does tend to be more incremental with any change that comes to pass, whereas the College Board tends to take really big swings all at once. Additionally, the science section will become optional for all students. This is going to be happening slightly gradually. We'll be explaining that in the next slide. But the first optional science test will be for those digital test takers in April. And then later on in the year, we have the exact date on the next slide, I think. Everyone, including the paper testers, will have the option to go without the science section. And then the more kind of technical nitty-gritty change is that the test will be overall a bit shorter, and there'll be generally more time per question. So bringing it a little bit more in line with what we expect from like a more SAT-like test. So this is that timeline I was alluding to a moment ago. So the science section will be optional for students taking it starting virtually or online in April 2025. And then the test will proceed as normal on paper for that June and July test date, as well as that April test date, as well as for international testing. And then in September 2025 is when what they're calling the EMR scores are going to be standardized. So that's the English, the math, and the reading scores are going to be the composite scores only, and then the science will be on its own as like a STEM score with the math if you choose to take it. So to put things more plainly, if you take it on paper up until that point, you will need to take science, and then after that point, you'll have the option either way if you take it on paper. For anyone that's on this call that does have school day ACT testing, which is not as common in our more regional area, in the Philadelphia area, but we have wonderful clients everywhere. So if any of you are in that zone where you've got the school day testing, these changes are not going to be rolling out until spring of 2026, although they've been a little bit cagey about exactly when that will happen. So no, not quite sure exactly when that will be, but there's usually only just a few administrations of that test anyway in the spring. So whatever one that you have will probably be digital. So the digital ACT is not a new test, which is good to know, although it will be obviously having those changes with the shorter and less speeded, as we like to say in the business, the less speeded option. But they have been having a digital option for school day testing for quite a few years now. They are pushing this digital testing out nationally. They are saying a lot of reasons, but the real reason is, as Jim has put on this slide, because they've lost their market share because so many students prefer to take the test on the computer. I basically, from what Janet, who is the CEO of the ACT, has said, and what our colleague who spoke with us at the National Test Prep Association has said, they are extremely committed to keeping that paper option, and which will be completely unchanged for now. But they are still trying to make sure that you have as many chances as possible to take the ACT so they can take down their competitor in a classic capitalist fashion. We don't know yet what the technology requirements will be, or if they will be unchanged from what they currently are. I believe that right now, the technology is similar to what the SAT has. And obviously, like all your Chromebooks and everything work well for that, if that's what your school has. But they haven't quite let us know exactly if the UI will be different than it is for the current school day testing. So this is kind of that slide that's a little bit more in the weeds slightly, which is just that we've got currently our classic ACT that's got our English, our math, our reading, and our science section. And we've also got our optional writing section. So right now, the writing section is only required by West Point. And so almost no one takes that writing section. We are theorizing that's probably the way of the science section as well, based on the data that they were providing. And they also provided that basically that the science section does not move your overall composite score that much. So now we've got our two optional sections, the science and the writing, and the core EMR sections, so those English, math, and reading sections. So the science is going to be split off from what they are now calling the core ACT sections. So the composite score, which is that average of all the sections that are required, will still be reported out of 36, and the science score will also be reported out of 36. They will also be combining the math and the science score into the STEM score, which is something that you can still see right now on your TIR, so your TIR reports or your normal score reports if you get them. But soon that science score will no longer be in the composite score at all, so not included in that average. And that will again be on that timeline that we discussed earlier. So starting in April 2025 for the digital test and September 2025 for the paper test. Colleges have not yet released their policies on which, like what they prefer. So if they are going to be requiring science, if they're not requiring science. So we got to really wait for everyone to catch up and take a little bit of a breath before we know for sure. But our advice is very firm in this matter at the moment, which is that all students should be taking the ACT science until we have a really firm decision on what colleges are taking, what they're requiring, what they're asking for.
All right, so we know that science is optional. We know that the test will be online. What the heck do they mean when they say that the test will be shorter and that you have more time per question? Well, just that. The ACT will be 44 total questions shorter. And now, to put this in perspective, the ACT used to have 215 questions. It will now have 171 total questions. The SAT, by comparison, has 98 total questions. So it's still going to be a longer, more question test than the SAT, but significantly fewer questions and more time per question than the than the previous version of the ACT. Still a faster paced test than the SAT, still more questions, but just kind of getting closer to the SAT in that regard. And so because I've often told our clients, and our clients who are in here right now will be able to say this back to me, that the ACT's biggest challenge is generally finishing on time. The SAT's questions are more complex, but they give you more time to work through them. And so this is going to kind of fundamentally make what has been the biggest challenge on the ACT for students historically a little bit easier. Now, before everyone says, wait a minute, does that mean it's just easier to get a higher score on the ACT? That's what you all said when the SAT was going digital. That, oh, well, it's on a screen and the reading passages are shorter, so every student will find it easier, so surely it'll be easier to get a higher score. That's not true when a test is graded on a curve, because it means that you're not necessarily doing any better relative to your peers, which is what matters on that kind of test, than you were before, if these things are getting easier for everyone. So the changes might affect some students more than others, but overall, we don't expect it to be any significantly easier or harder writ large to get a better score on the test. Another big development for test takers is that the experimental section of the ACT that can sometimes pop up is being eliminated. So the students could sometimes get a fifth section of the ACT when they took it, and that would give extra data to ACT to test out different questions. And they know, okay, this student got a 27 on the ACT. This is how they performed on these questions. They gather that data and they use it to design future tests. The experimental questions will be worked into the sections now. So in a way, the sections are being double shortened because they're being shortened just by raw number of questions. And some of those remaining questions are now experimental questions. So they're sort of being shortened from both ends in that way in terms of number of questions. So when we say it's a less speeded test, it will actually be a shorter test. So if we look at the classic ACT, it's 2 hours and 55 minutes of actual test time. If you take the full version of the new test, which is what we have here laid out as Core ACT plus Science, you're only really saving 5 minutes. That's because they've actually made the science section longer and the reading section longer while shrinking math and shrinking English. But the test without science, which will probably be the test of the far future once the dust settles on colleges' policies, but we can't say right now, it is the test you should take because colleges haven't said anything about how necessary this science section is. That will be a significantly shorter test, and it will actually be shorter than the digital SAT. The digital SAT, I believe, is 2 hours and 14 minutes total. So in terms of the increase in time per question, it's pretty significant. And we just have those numbers laid out here so that you can see the actual questions per section. So in ACT English, you're actually getting 1/3 fewer questions, math 1/4 fewer questions, reading 10% fewer questions. Science is staying at the same number of questions. And that's why that's the section that's most dramatically increasing in length. So the other thing to note here is that there will be some small content changes coming to the test. And this is something that was totally absent from ACT's initial announcement. And they really are going to be, in the grand scheme of things, quite minor in terms of a preparation standpoint for students. The actual kind of guide to the test that determines what is actually tested in terms of the underlying skills and knowledge that students need to have isn't changing at all. So when we talk about the underlying actual content, it's the same stuff, but ways that that content is being tested will change. So English and math have the biggest changes to them. English is going to add one passage that's argumentative in nature. So the passages have generally been kind of explanatory in nature, and now they'll have an argumentative passage. There will be some new question types, particularly that go with that argumentative passage. So I anticipate that there'll be things like asking how the author could strengthen their argument or something like that. But there could be other new question stems as well. The way the ACT announced it opened the door for them to add other things, but the same fundamental topics, largely grammar, some rhetorical skills, are what are going to be tested. And the lengths of those passages are going to shorten as well, with the more time per question and less time overall. Math, big change from a student standpoint is that there will be 4 answer choices instead of 5. This doesn't really change how you study or prepare for the test, but it does make you pretty significantly more likely to guess correctly. So it's kind of nice for students. But again, if it's that much easier for everyone to guess correctly, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's easier for you to get a better score. And I cannot stress that enough. So there will also be fewer of the lowest level and highest level questions on the test. My guess is because ACT is easing up on the difficulty of the time limit, that they will remove more of the lower difficulty questions than they will of the higher difficulty questions, as a way to balance out the difficulty level a little bit. But there will be fewer of both categories than there currently are as a percentage of the overall test. And then the word problems in the math sections will be shorter. They're going to cut back on the very, very lengthy word problems that can sometimes appear on the ACT. The SAT is better known for very lengthy word problems than the ACT is, but the ACT certainly does have them. In reading, the main difference is that passage lengths will be shorter. And there's not really much more to say than that. By the way, you'll notice that we've titled this slide Content Change Highlights. There are a lot more inside baseball things we can get into about, like, integrating key ideas, question types in the reading section, but that doesn't mean anything to all of you necessarily. If you really want to get in the weeds on any of that, then use that QR code and we can talk about it anytime you'd like.
We'd be delighted. We'd be
Yeah,
delighted
we
to
would
share that on
truly
this with
be
you.
delighted, but we figured it wouldn't be worth everyone's time here tonight. And then in the science section, one big change, one passage on each science test is going to be committed to addressing a topic in engineering or design. And that's to kind of shift with students' priorities. And I think probably the way the ACT sees the science section going, which is that it will be the kind of thing that is required by more technical programs. And then there will be more questions that actually involve science knowledge. So currently on the ACT, I would say on any given test, there are like 2 to 4 questions where the student really needs to have some degree of science knowledge to answer them. And that's not necessarily including certain things that you could call science knowledge or you could call common sense. But they have said there will be more questions that involve that kind of outside background science knowledge. So that's for the questions we have answered. There are some unresolved questions here. So will ACT stick to this April 2025 launch date? It's not what they announced on their website. They said spring 2025 on their website. In the private webinar they gave to us as the NTPA, they said the plan is for April 2025, but they're not committing 1,000,000% to that deadline. One thing you can definitely say in favor of College Board is when they tell you they'll do something by a certain date, it will be done by that date. If they announce it officially, then you can take it to the bank. The ACT, they like to give themselves a little more wiggle room with these kinds of things. So we're confident and optimistic it'll be April 2025, but they've left themselves an out, I'll say, in the way that they've phrased certain things. Will there be a TIR for the new test? Tori alluded to the TIR earlier. It stands for Test Information Release. And it essentially means that you can get a copy of the test that you took, as well as what specific questions that you missed. So our hope is that ACT will continue to offer the TIR because it's great for students to be able to actually see what they missed, particularly when we're working with students with a high degree of test anxiety. You know, things can happen on test day that never happen in any of their practice tests. So when we're working with them on practice tests leading up to the test, things are going one way. They get a disappointing score on test day, and we want to see in the weeds with them, okay, what actually went differently this time so we can work on strategies to make sure that doesn't happen next time. And the TIR is super valuable for that. So we're really hoping that this option remains. College Board got rid of their comparable service. They called it the question and answer service, but it was the same thing. When they went digital, they claimed it was because of the adaptive nature of the test, essentially making it so that it was not practical for them to be releasing test items anymore and what the actual questions were. And so ACT's new test is not adaptive. It is not changing in any way based on a student's performance on earlier questions. And so that leaves them the space to continue offering that TIR. And I think ACT has been very cognizant in this process of what its differentiators are from the SAT. Tori mentioned earlier, one of the big reasons to kind of rush to put this change out is because of all the market share they lost to the SAT. And they know that students really like that TIR. So we're hopeful that that's enough of a reason for them to keep it around. Will the difficulty of ACT questions change in any significant way to offset the new easier time limit? ACT has said that the difficulty level of the questions themselves will not change. Now, that doesn't mean the difficulty level of the sections will not change. Yeah. For instance, as I alluded to earlier in the math section, if you have a lower percentage of the easiest questions on the test, you've made the test harder, but you haven't made the questions harder. You just got rid of the easier questions. You see what I mean? So exactly how they're going to be managing the fact that they have removed a big difficulty barrier and they need to keep the test balanced and keep scores comparable year to year, it remains to be seen. Speaking of what remains to be seen, when will they release new practice materials in the new format and when? And they have said they're really working on putting out new practice materials that you'll be able to take in a digital interface similar to the College Board Blue Book app. But it's not ready yet, and they will let us know when it's ready. And if you're on our mailing list, you will know the moment it's ready because we will make sure to tell you. So with all that said, what's the actual takeaway here? So I'll talk big picture first, and then we'll get into the weeds on everybody's questions. So first of all, if you or your student is a sophomore, rising sophomore, that is, starting sophomore year in the fall or younger, just stay tuned for more information. There's no reason to try to put a plan together for this new version of the test when we're still waiting for so much new information from ACT. The earliest a sophomore would really be thinking about SAT or ACT is like PSAT time in October. And sometimes our sophomores will take diagnostic testing to compare a practice ACT with that sophomore year SAT score to have an idea of which test to focus on for their prep. But really, most students aren't going to be prepping until the summer before junior year at the earliest, unless there's some kind of exception. And so really the answer is, if you're in that age group, kind of stay tuned for more information and we'll keep you as updated as we can. And when we reach out with our normal information about the PSAT around October for those classes, we will make sure to update you on what's going on with the ACT and how to act in terms of making your decision between SAT and ACT. For juniors who are planning to test for the first time in the fall, stick to your plan. You've been preparing for a version of the test that will be still available all through this spring. You can take the paper test in an unchanged form all the way through the spring. And you even have the February test date before the change happens. So there's really no reason to change your plan if you're on that kind of course. If your plan as a junior was to test for the first time in the spring, then typically what makes the most sense is to wait until PSAT scores come back, compare a diagnostic in the new form of the ACT, which we'll hopefully have a practice test of around that time, so that we can make plans to get ready for the right test in the spring. And so if that changes, or if we don't have that test yet, we will reach out with updated guidance when it's time to actually get plans rolled. And then finally, make sure you do sign up to take it with the science section until further notice. If we hear a tidal wave of colleges saying, we don't want it, we don't want it, we don't want it, we'll tell you not to take it. But really, until we know anything about what colleges want, currently, they all take the science section. And so the change would really be if they decided to not allow the science section. And so we'll have to wait and see how that part of it goes. All right, that is all of our prepared presentation. And so now we jump into the fun stuff, Q&A time. Okay, so we'll start with the Q&A, and then we'll go to the questions from the chat. Question number 1. I repeatedly hear from educators and students that the ACT is less challenging or easier than the SAT, but because of its abundance of questions, that advantage is negated. 2 questions. Do you believe that the ACT is less challenging? And will that disadvantage be nullified with the changes on the new ACT? Good question. So, Tori, you want to take this one?
I suppose. I mean, I think that our answer is that we're not quite sure yet. First of all, I think the ACT is not less challenging necessarily because of how much, I mean, just of how much longer it is at the moment. The questions, I would say they're asking the same information, but they're not asking them in a way that's meant to be confusing. So that's why typically we also like recommend that students that have, depending on their LD, or learning difference, lots of students with learning differences do a little bit better on that test just because they're asking that same information. It's like exactly the same amount of like challenge rating. It's just that the way that they're asking the question is more straightforward. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's easier. It's just that it's a really different type of test, and the way that they're approaching the questions and the way that they're like interfacing with the students is not similar, honestly.
Yeah.
Um, and I also don't
My,
think that we
go
know
ahead.
if the disadvantage is going to be nullified with the changes. I mean, as Jim was saying, like we hope that, not that we hope, like it's graded on a curve. So what will happen is up to how the students all do, you know?
Yeah, and I think the worst case scenario is that the test itself actually is easier as a result of this in ways that ACT's pre-testing couldn't somehow detect. In that case, because it is graded on a curve, it just means that the curve would be really volatile at the top, meaning that, you know, getting one question wrong could significantly swing your score. But in other words, it might be more of a, did you get a perfect score or not kind of situation at the top. And again, that's a worst case scenario. And that would have to mean ACT did a really bad job of all of their digital pilot testing that they've been doing since February. So that I really hope that's not the case. But you know, it certainly is true that the ACT's questions are more straightforward. The hardest questions in ACT math can be every bit as hard as SAT math questions. There's this one, you know, the math problem about the minivans and sedans. It's a super complicated probability question, and most of our students, they don't do any kind of statistics until they might take like AP statistics senior year. And so that becomes about as challenging of a math question as you'll ever see on a standardized test, and that's an ACT question. So I don't think necessarily that the test will just be easier because of the time limit change, but certainly it is going to be something that we're monitoring. All right.
Yes,
Another question. Did I hear that ACT will calculate a STEM score by combining the science if taken and math subsections? Will this be reported formally when the results are released? So the simple answer is yes, and they already are. So when a student gets their ACT score report, you get the 4 subsections of English, math, reading, and science, all out of 36, your composite score, which is an average of those 4. And then they also report a separate STEM score, which is just the average of math and science reported as its own number. So that's already a feature of the score reports and will continue to be one only for students who take the science section. All right. Next question. If you have an incoming junior who's planning to take the ACT this fall, I assume that it is still a good plan to take the full paper test. Yes, exactly. If you had already determined, by trying out the SAT and ACT that the ACT is the test for you, then nothing about this announcement, especially if you're on a timeline to test in the fall, should be affecting your plans at all. It is still such a great idea if you have the math under your belt to try to get this test out of the way before the spring of junior year. So I would absolutely advise just try to knock it out on the paper test. If you end up wanting to try the digital option for some reason in the spring, we can talk about it, use the link. But again, really going for it on the paper test is going to make the most sense if that's the plan you're already set on. All right. Next, I fear that the optionality will bring headache and heartache to students and educators. Me too. Do I take the science section to impress the colleges to which I apply, even if not required? And will these colleges consider it if I do take it? Optionality also means more work for ACT coordinators, assigning students to separate locations for paper tests at least. And will a student be able to switch from science to no science on the morning of testing? I recall as a former SAT coordinator what a hot mess it was when SAT had an optional writing section. Yeah, basically, I mean, there are 4 permutations of the test. There's the core, there will be this core ACT that's just English, math, and reading. Then there'll be English, math, reading, and science. Then there'll be English, math, reading, science, and writing. And then there'll be the full paper test, English, math, reading, and science. And then you can do that one with writing. So it is an absolute mess for schools and ACT coordinators, and I really feel for them and for students. We've seen a lot that test optional has added headaches for students when a lot of its kind of purported value was to alleviate headaches for students. And I would hate to see colleges all just kind of pass the buck on to students and say, well, we're going to make the science optional like ACT made it optional. I'd love to see them just stand up and say, we want it or we don't. If you don't, that's okay. If you decide that that's not valuable for you in the way you're evaluating students, great. But I really do hope that colleges actually take responsibility and make a stand. If you submit an ACT score, we want science. If you don't submit it, then you can stay test optional. But more optionality in this process is absolutely going to confuse students and parents. And once again, link is there if you need my help. All right, questions in the chat. All right. So, question from Holly: Have they been talking again about the single section retake that was a hot topic a few years back? Tori, you want to take that one?
Yeah. So in our private presentation, they did say that they are actually thinking about this again, but they aren't saying whether or not they'll actually do it. They were just like, it's never stopped being something that we were thinking about, and we're still thinking about it. And we're like, well, that's not that helpful, is it? So it's still a possibility, just the way that it's been a possibility all this time. But I wouldn't hold your breath, basically. I would say is sort of the situation with all of this. Like, there's a lot of changes happening. And they don't want to show their hand too much, I think, at the moment.
Yeah. Next question. Are you still recommending that high school students take both an SAT and an ACT diagnostic test to determine the best test for them? My child is a rising sophomore, so is thinking of doing a diagnostic test of each in spring of 2025, with the projected plan of taking the test in very early fall 2025 as a junior. So absolutely, we're still recommending students do diagnostic testing between these 2 tests to determine which is the right fit for them. I think the question for sophomores is just when are we going to get that practice test? But if your plan is to do the diagnostic testing in the spring, you should have no problem, because I would hope they'll release at least one practice test for the ACT that we'd be able to use for those diagnostic purposes before the first official ACT in this new format is given, which will be in the April test date window. The other thing is that even if you take the diagnostic test on paper, that paper test will still be available, but it will change in terms of length and number of questions in September. So that's something to consider, but I still think I will say this: if a student tests that ACT is better than SAT for them on the current version of the ACT, then it's pretty clear to me that the new version would still be the better of the two tests for them. The other way around, I wouldn't necessarily say is true, because the current version of the ACT is sort of the more extreme version of the ACT, because it does have that longer format and more questions in less time. If you're already better at that than you are at the SAT, then you're going to be better at the new format as well. So definitely for sophomores and for freshmen, a year from then, testing spring of sophomore year between the two to figure out which one's the better fit for you is absolutely still the right idea. Awesome. All right. Thanks everyone for tuning into our mini webinar here. We are going to put this up on YouTube. So if you have any friends, family members, students who are here, if you want to show your parents, parents who are here, if you want to show your students, there will be a YouTube link up later this week. So thanks for joining us, and hope you all have a great night. Bye-bye.